Well, the motor locks up, and later that day, I was immediately taking the whole motor apart again and find that the third crank bearing is seized because of a double pins failure. And it was partially my fault as well though, considering I thought that the double pins was just fine, but it turns out it didn't. So let's just get back to the videos instead, shall we? And here it is, the seized third crank bearing, the one right next to the camshaft drive gear. With the help of 180, 1000 and 2000 grit sandpaper and a whole night sanding, here is the result. To make it easier, I've used a torch to remove and install both cam gear driver and the distributor gear to expand them. Then, making sure all the bearings are seated nicely in the crankcase. Use a paint to check whether they are in contact or they didn't. And sand the bearing more if it wasn't seated nicely. However, taking the case and crankshaft to the machine shop and bought a brand new crank bearing is a lot better and much preferred. Double check everything prior to the assembly. The end plate and the radial plate without oil to make sure they do really rotate well. And if the whole checking process are done, it is fine to start the assembly. Clean the surface and use enough lubrication to make the whole assembly easier and safer. Use a rubber hammer while positioning the crank and its bearing. Pay attention once the node changed, it is seated already. I like to mark the bearing wear on top of it to make sure the bearing holes are aligned with dowel pins. A quick reminder, all the dowel pins are faced towards the flywheel. It wasn't positioned in the center. Another reminder, the oil deflector plate concave side should face towards the crank pulley. Check the crank rotations once it is seated. Lubricate the cam bearing as well. Rotate it with crank to see any cam lifting issues and check the aligning mark which dot. It is actually a lot easier to install the distributor gear before installing the crankshaft, but it is still fine as long as it works. And make sure the first and second spark plug wire are located in the right side of the motor to make it tidier. Every distributor has different aligning position. Suit yourself. Well, turns out I'm forgetting the lifters, and don't repeat the same mistake as I do. When all the rotating assembly have done, put enough gasket maker. I'm using a Victor rain sealer, since it is the best I could get in Indonesia. Don't forget to make some way for the first and second rod. Use a special tool to hold the lifters. And for me, it was just a thick weld wire. And give a little tap with a rubber hammer to close the case tightly. Put some gasket maker on the main bolt ring as well. Torque the 6 main bolts to 25 foot-pounds with the correct sequences. And I'll put all the motor torque guides here. Nothing special on installing the oil strainer. Put enough gasket makers and you're good to go. Install the oil seal on the flywheel with the open side face inside and put a little oil on it. Gently tap it. I'm using a piston sleeve as the tool if you're wondering. Put a little oil on the flywheel O-ring and evenly rub it. Putting some grease in the flywheel ball thread is preferred to avoid corrosion. Give a little tap on the flywheel and make sure it is seated nicely. And make sure the markings of the flywheel installation just in case the crankshaft and the flywheel has been balanced. The flywheel bolt should be torqued to 253 foot-pounds, but since I'm using a torque multiplier tool for the installation, I set the torque to 65, since the tool and flywheel gear ratio is a quarter. Put enough gasket maker on the barrel's gasket. Install the piston pin from flywheel side for first and third cylinder and from the pulley side for the second and fourth cylinder. Double check whether the snap ring has seated nicely by rotating it. Once the piston and the barrels are installed, check all the arrow which should be faced towards the flywheel. Then proceed to install the cooling tin. Well, it is all I got though. However, the T3 model cooling tin is the best one to get, they say. While installing the cylinder head, pay attention to the pushrod tube welded surface, which should be pointed upwards to minimize any oil leak possibilities. And yes, it is a Germany car which really loves to leak some. Torque the cylinder head bolts to 23 foot-pounds with the correct sequences. Put a little oil inside the pushrod as well, its contact surface to decrease all the noise when you first start the motor. Install the rocker shaft with the cutaway pointed upwards and torque them to 18 foot-pounds. Then, set the gap from 0.1 to 0.15 mm to make the valve train to be quieter. Torque the crank pulley to 32 foot-pounds. Another important check, which should be done before installing the pulley, is the end play of the crank, which should be ranged within 0.07 till 0.13 mm. If you insist on installing them just like me, since it is 0.2, the rotating assembly will be a little bit noisy. I repeat the build with brand new crank bearing and tighter end play, around 0.1 mm, which is perfect. Install the clutch and the pressure plate with the alignment tool. Since I don't have one, I use an output shaft of the broken gearbox. Torque the clutch bolt to 18 foot-pounds. Since the rest of the assembly will be easy, I'ma put a time lapse on it. It was such a nice first start, but don't be like me for being impatient and revving the motor without breaking them in first. The cats was still fairly new for me, hence the setting haven't dialed yet. And forgive me for being so curious on trying to put on the cats. Then later that night, I'm putting the Weber back since it has already dialed. And I'm curious on how well the motor runs on higher RPMs. I haven't put any proper fuel line yet, so this time it was just running out of the car's tank, and dumbass me really forgot to break them in. This is the actual proper braking in rig. A bike fuel tank, proper fuel pump, as well as the oil pressure light. For the braking in, the timing was set to 7.5 before top dead center, and the motor should be left idling at 2500 rpm or until the oil pressure light going off for around 10 minutes, or maybe even less if the motor isn't fairly new.